PTSD is a modern diagnosis, but the symptoms we now attribute to it are not. And while traumatic experiences have been described for centuries, the word itself didn't come into usage until 1656, when it meant of, pertaining to, or caused by a wound, injury, or shock. Samuel Pepys, whose diary gives us an eyewitness account of England in the 1660s, experienced both the last plague pandemic in London and the ensuing Great Fire. 6 months later, he wrote, "It is strange to think how, to this very day, I cannot sleep at night without great terrors of fire, and this very night I could not sleep till almost 2 in the morning through thoughts of fire." 2 centuries later, trains, factories, and rapid industrial growth were changing how people lived and worked. With the advent of mass transit via rail, a new kind of mass traumatic event, train wrecks and derailments, led to a new diagnosis, railway spine. This was a collection of symptoms including chronic back pain, sensory disturbances, and psychological distress from the train accidents. It was originally attributed to inflammation of the spinal cord or concussion of the spine, and could be diagnosed even when there were no visible physical injuries. These rail accidents led to the need for insurance coverage, since the companies could be held liable for injuries and trauma caused by train crashes, and that led to legal battles over compensation. If compensation depended on proving injury, then courts and physicians had to decide whether symptoms without visible wounds were legitimate. During the Civil War, Da Costa syndrome, or soldier's irritable heart diagnoses, were developed. This syndrome included symptoms of hyperventilation, heart palpitations, very high pulse rate, and shortness of breath that were not due to any recognizable organic disease. They didn't link these symptoms to post-combat stress, but to overexertion or predisposing factors, such as family history and weak constitutions. They were edging closer to an understanding. However, mentally traumatized Civil War veterans who had no visible signs of injuries were disqualified from getting a pension. For millennia, the expectations of male response to trauma, especially the trauma of battle in war, had been bound up in the concept of manhood. Men who acted courageously in traumatic circumstances were idolized, while men who did not were stigmatized as cowards. It was a sign of strong character that men returning from war were expected to forget the past and simply move on. This expectation survived for at least another 100 years, and many people still think so. But Sigmund Freud and other European psychiatrists argued that traumatic experiences could leave lasting psychological wounds, thus shifting attention from visible injuries to invisible ones. The mechanized slaughter of the First World War left millions dead and many more psychologically shattered. Soldiers returned home unable to speak, unable to walk, trembling uncontrollably, or reliving the horrors they had experienced at the front. Many physicians believed these symptoms resulted from the physical effects of exploding artillery shells, giving rise to the term shell shock. Others observed that soldiers with no physical injuries displayed the same symptoms, arguing that psychological trauma alone could produce them. So, the debate over whether trauma belonged to the body or the mind continued. And while the terminology changed with each conflict, the pattern did not. During the Second World War, it became known as combat neurosis. Holocaust survivors experienced what came to be called Buchenwald syndrome. Veterans returning from Korea and Vietnam continued to report intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness long after the fighting had ended. Researchers gradually realized these reactions were not confined to soldiers. Survivors of natural disasters, serious accidents, sexual assault, and other forms of violence described many of the same symptoms. Trauma was not simply a military problem, it was a human one. The diagnostic labels continued to evolve. The first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, published in 1952, included gross stress reaction, a temporary response to extraordinary stress. The second edition replaced it with transient situational disturbance. Finally, in 1980, the DSM-3 introduced the diagnosis we know today, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. What stands out to me is that the expectation of people, both men and women, to just buck up after a traumatic experience didn't completely disappear when the diagnosis changed. The language changed, but the cultural pressure hasn't left us. Ilana, do Indigenous cultures have that pressure? How do they handle trauma and what we've come to call PTSD?
That's an important question. Many Indigenous cultures approach trauma similarly.
Experiences like war, violence, loss, displacement, and grief have all existed for thousands of years before we had a label for post traumatic stress. So that raises the question, how did people respond to trauma before psychology existed? For many Indigenous cultures around the world, trauma was never viewed as something that only affected our minds. It was understood as something that disrupted balance within the whole person, their minds, their body, and their spirit, as well as their relationships with family, community, ancestors, and the natural world. It's important to recognize that there is no single Indigenous worldview. There are hundreds of distinct cultures with their own beliefs and healing traditions. What I'm talking about today are several themes that appear across many Indigenous communities. In Western medicine, treatment often centers on the individual. You meet with a therapist or a physician, receive a diagnosis, and work towards reducing symptoms. Many Indigenous traditions take a much broader view. Healing is often understood as restoring balance, not just within one person, but within community itself. This is one of the biggest differences between Western medicine and Indigenous practices. So, what does healing within the community look like? Healing in community often involves many different practices. Ceremony plays an important role in many Indigenous communities. Ceremonies may include prayer, songs, drumming, dancing, sweat lodges, or other sacred traditions depending on the culture. These practices aren't simply rituals for ritual's sake. They reinforce identity, belonging, and connection to something larger than oneself. Some Indigenous traditions also incorporate sacred plant medicines into ceremonial healing. For example, the Native American Church uses peyote as a sacrament in guided ceremonies that combine prayer, singing, drumming, and reflection. Their practices reinforce spiritual renewal, strengthen community bonds, encourage personal insight, and serve as a means to restore balance within themselves and the natural world. Healing is rarely viewed as something someone has to do alone with Indigenous practices. Family members, elders, spiritual leaders, shamans, Indigenous medicine practitioners, and the community participate in supporting recovery. Instead of asking, what's wrong with this person? The question within the community becomes, how can we restore harmony within the relationships that surround them? Storytelling is another important form of healing within community care. Stories allow people to share difficult experiences, process emotions, pass knowledge between generations, and make meaning from suffering. Storytelling creates space for painful experiences to become part of a larger collective history. There's no cultural expectation within Indigenous rituals for someone to just move on. Another important part of Indigenous healing is reconnecting to the land. For many Indigenous people, land is not simply a place where people live. Most Indigenous cultures have relationships with the land and the natural world. Their relationship with the land is deeply connected to identity, culture, spirituality, and well-being. Returning to traditional lands, participating in cultural practices, or reconnecting with ancestral knowledge can all be part of the healing process. All of this helps the person who has experienced a traumatic event feel held, understood, empowered, and safe. So far, we've learned how Indigenous cultures approach healing. But every story has a turning point. And for many Indigenous communities, that turning point wasn't chosen. It arrived through colonization. In North America, colonization brought forced political and cultural control of indigenous people, forced relocation, residential and boarding schools, the suppression of indigenous languages, and attempts to erase indigenous cultures. These horrendous acts of violence and erasure created trauma that extended far beyond a single generation. Psychologist Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart introduced the concept of historical trauma to describe the cumulative emotional and psychological wounds experienced across generations as a result of these collective events. This concept completely shifts our understanding of trauma. Instead of seeing trauma as only an individual's experience, historical trauma recognizes that entire communities can carry the effects of violence, displacement, and cultural loss across generations. And that's really the heart of it. If trauma can be carried across generations, healing has to go beyond the individual person. Many researchers are beginning to recognize something Indigenous communities have understood for a long time. Healing involves more than changing brain chemistry or reducing symptoms. It involves relationships. It involves meaning and belonging. It involves community. Today, interest in Indigenous approaches to healing extends beyond ceremony and community. Researchers have also begun examining traditional plant medicines that some Indigenous cultures have used for generations in sacred and structured ceremonial contexts. As research on psychedelic-assisted therapy continues to grow, many Western scholars are acknowledging the importance of ceremony, connection, and intentional healing spaces.
Cassie, we've looked at what PTSD is and how trauma has been understood and healed through Indigenous traditions. What's today's media saying about psychedelic treatments for PTSD?
Well, the predominant media narrative around PTSD and trauma is now largely positive. In the media, people with PTSD and trauma are increasingly portrayed as capable of recovery rather than permanently damaged, and psychedelics are often presented as part of that hope. We all know Michael Pollan's 2018 book, How to Change Your Mind, catapulted the conversation around psychedelics and their therapeutic potential into mainstream discourse, and how it was later reinforced with its 4-part Netflix adaptation in 2022. Soon after, a 2023 New Yorker article titled The Rebranding of MDMA looks more specifically at that history, explaining how the chemist Alexander Shulgin helped reintroduce MDMA to a small network of therapists in the 70s. And then by the early 80s, it was literally being sold under the name therapy before becoming known as ecstasy and being associated with rave culture throughout the 90s. Of course, then we have veterans with PTSD whose stories have dominated much of the public discourse around psychedelics and trauma. Organizations like the Heroic Hearts Project and Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions provide services to veterans seeking psychedelic treatment for PTSD and advocate for more research and access. We're also seeing this in other types of media like In Waves and War, which follows former Navy SEALs seeking Ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT treatment for combat-related PTSD. The documentary reinforces the hopeful narrative by presenting psychedelics as a positive and possible route toward recovery for veterans who have not found enough relief through conventional care. There's also the 2025 60 Minutes segment, which followed 9 veterans attending a Heroic Hearts retreat. By presenting their stories and experiences in a positive light, the segment brought psychedelic treatment to a broad, often older audience that may not otherwise see it portrayed as a credible form of care. Veterans and first responders are especially influential within this narrative because their stories can reach across political and cultural groups where skepticism toward psychedelics may be more common. The trauma narrative also goes beyond combat-related PTSD. We're seeing things like the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs assessment, which has shed light on how trauma and childhood adversity can accumulate and affect health well into adulthood. Similarly, the book Trauma Proofing Your Kids expands the public understanding of childhood trauma by showing how everyday experiences can overwhelm children, and it gives parents practical tools for responding when that happens. The broader trauma conversation has also begun to recognize racial trauma as a historical and collective experience. In the book, My Grandmother's Hands, Resmaa Menakem traces racialized trauma through centuries of racism and describes how its effects can be carried across generations, families, and communities. His work moves the trauma narrative beyond a specific event or diagnosis of a single individual. Returning to the positive narrative around psychedelics, one of its most ambitious expressions comes from the head of MAPS, Rick Doblin, who has proposed an almost utopian goal of achieving net zero trauma by 2070 and sees expanded access to MDMA-assisted therapy as part of that vision. That vision was directly challenged by writer Natalie Story in a Substack post titled "Net Zero Trauma is Creepy." She argues that the promise of eliminating trauma through psychedelics becomes a form of spiritual bypassing, allowing society to avoid confronting the systems that produce harm while those controlling access and the market stand to profit. The Symposia organization offers another related counter-narrative. In The Psychedelic Syndicate, its writers argue that veterans' suffering and the urgency of PTSD were used to build support for MDMA approval and protect its institutional and financial interests. So the positive narrative matters because it gives people hope and helps make psychedelic treatment more credible. But critics ask whether trauma, and especially veterans' suffering, is also being used to create urgency, legitimacy, and financial opportunity. The larger question, and one we've returned to several times throughout this program, is whether the people whose stories make this movement so persuasive are also the ones who ultimately benefit from it. So clearly trauma is being explored across a much wider range of experiences than I could cover here. I even had to leave out areas like medical and end-of-life trauma, complex PTSD, trauma related to sexual abuse, because there just wasn't enough time. Ilana, was there anything in particular that resonated with you?
Yeah, I really appreciate in Resmaa's book his points about the generational trauma and all the pain and coping behaviors passed down through families over generations. His book focuses on the Black community, yet as we've learned, many cultures not rooted in whiteness has experienced this type of generational PTSD.
You know, speaking of generations, what caught my attention was the book Trauma Proofing Your Kids. There was nothing around like that when I was raising children. I mean, to think of it, knowing how to prevent trauma or to help children who have experienced trauma so that they don't have to wait 40 years and deal with it later would be really a great thing. I mean, for me, one of the things that I discovered in researching the history of PTSD is that PTSD is definitely the diagnosis of our time.
Right. And that's what's brought about the second wave of psychedelics in our culture. We want to help people lessen their pain and suffering.
Yeah, and so while I don't think we'll ever get to net zero trauma, at least psychedelics combined with intentional integration work, it gives us something to hope for.